Welcome to Mild History, a place for slow stories and quiet journeys. If you're watching tonight, let us know where you're tuning in from. It helps us know who shares this table. Now picture yourself in the 19th century, stepping into the age of steam. The world is changing, the air is thick with smoke, and the familiar pace of life is giving way to something both faster and harder. This is the world of Victorian travel, and tonight, we will walk through it slowly, patiently, and in detail. The 19th century unfolded to the sound of iron wheels, to the hiss of steam, and to the slow realization that distance itself was shrinking. The Victorian era, from 1837 to 1901, was a bridge between worlds. On one side stood the old rhythms of stagecoaches and sail ships, journeys measured in days or months, endurance written into every mile. On the other side lay locomotives, steamships, and schedules, new machines that promised speed but delivered it with smoke, soot, and strain. To us, travel often feels like a convenience. For the Victorians, it was both a marvel and a burden. Before steam, journeys were slow and uncertain. A coach ride from London to Edinburgh could take 4 or 5 days, rattling over rough turnpikes, stopping at inns where food was coarse and rest uncertain. Sea voyages stretched for weeks, even months, sails dependent on winds that could vanish or storms that could destroy. Voyages to America or India were as much gamble as plan. Only the wealthy or the desperate attempted them, and both endured fatigue and risk. The Industrial Revolution changed this. With steam, days became hours, weeks became days. The world bent under the rhythm of machines. Railways spread across Britain, steamships crossed the Atlantic on schedule, and travel ceased to be the preserve of the elite alone. Ordinary workers and clerks began to board trains, families booked berths on steamers, and the world moved in new ways. And yet progress never came free. Speed was bought with discomfort. Trains rattled, carriages filled with soot, sparks fell on passengers, and windows funneled smoke into lungs. Steamships rolled in storms, cabins reeked of coal and sickness, and steerage passengers endured airless holds where disease spread easily. Class determined everything. Wealthy travelers enjoyed cushioned compartments, upholstered cabins, and meals served in saloons, while the poor sat on hard benches or lay in crowded bunks, their journeys remembered in exhaustion more than discovery. The Victorian age was proud of progress, but the voices of its travelers remind us that progress was complicated. Charles Dickens wrote of overcrowded trains and rough manners. Anthony Trollope described endless delays, poor inns, and fatigue. Others complained of seasickness, of soot, of delays that tested patience. But these same voices also marveled. The Alps in days rather than weeks. The Atlantic in a fortnight rather than 2 months. Paris, Rome, Venice, places that once felt like distant dreams, now reached in a single summer. Travel became a paradox, faster but no easier, broader but no less tiring. Railways spread with astonishing speed. In 1830, Britain had barely 100 miles of track. By 1870, over 14,000 miles connected the nation. Villages once cut off found themselves linked to cities. Markets grew as fresh fish, milk, and produce were rushed by rail before they spoiled. Newspapers traveled overnight. Clocks themselves were unified into railway time, synchronizing towns by the timetable of trains. The sound of whistles echoed through valleys and cities alike, and with it, a new sense of motion. On the sea, steamships carried both privilege and poverty. The Cunard Line, founded in 1840, sent mail packets and passengers across the Atlantic with unprecedented reliability. Wealthy passengers dined under chandeliers, writing letters on polished desks as stewards attended them. Beneath in steerage, emigrants slept side by side in narrow bunks, cooked meager food over shared stoves, and endured stench, seasickness, and disease. Yet they came in their millions, fleeing famine, poverty, or seeking opportunity. For them, the journey was endured, not enjoyed, endured because beyond the horizon lay America, Canada, Australia, land, work, and possibility. The class divide was stark. On the same ship, one world glowed with silver and wine while another choked on darkness and foul air. On the same train, one compartment was lined with velvet while another rattled with cold and soot. The journey was shared in space but divided in reality. Wealth bought comfort, poverty endured necessity. Travel was progress, but progress was not equal. The railways themselves were marvels of engineering. Viaducts spanned valleys, tunnels bored through hills, and great stations rose in cities. London's Street Pancras, with its soaring iron roof, was as much a cathedral as any church, a monument to steam and ambition. Paddington and King's Cross became gateways to the country, bustling with passengers, porters, and the constant hiss of locomotives. Smaller stations dotted the countryside, often no more than a platform and a shelter, but they carried the same sense of wonder. To step onto a station was to step into a world of timetables and motion, a place where the local met the global. But for all their grandeur, railways were noisy, dirty, and sometimes dangerous. Sparks flew, cinders landed in laps, and the smell of coal was everywhere. Conversations were shouted over the roar of engines. Accidents made headlines, derailments, collisions, fires. The Clayton Tunnel crash of 1861 killed dozens, leaving the public shaken. The fear of railway accidents never disappeared, even as safety improved. Passengers boarded trains with awe and unease, conscious of the power and the risk. Third-class travel was the harshest. Passengers often sat in open wagons, exposed to the wind and rain. Benches were hard, if they existed at all. Some carriages had no roofs, leaving travelers drenched in storms. The cheap tickets brought mobility to the working classes, but at great discomfort. Yet for many, this was the only way to reach the seaside, to visit family, or to seek work in distant towns. They endured, their faces streaked with soot, their clothes reeking of smoke. Travel was hardship, but it was possible, and possibility was enough. First-class passengers lived another reality. Their compartments were enclosed, cushioned, and sometimes even heated. Curtains kept drafts away, rugs warmed legs, and attendants carried luggage. They read newspapers, wrote letters, or gazed out windows in relative comfort. The same train carried both privilege and poverty, but the experience could not have been more different. The railway democratized movement while reinforcing class, a paradox that defined the Victorian age itself. At sea, the division was sharper still. On the upper decks, wealthy travelers strolled in the fresh air, played cards in lounges, and dined on roasts, puddings, and wines. They wrote letters home describing sunsets over the Atlantic, the elegance of meals, the novelty of foreign ports. Stewards polished silver and tended cabins, creating a floating echo of domestic refinement. Beneath them, emigrants endured airless holds, rows of bunks crammed with bodies, poor food, and little privacy. Seasickness turned steerage into misery, and disease spread quickly in the close air. Children cried in the dark, and the weak sometimes did not survive the voyage. Bodies were buried at sea, lowered into waves with simple prayers. The same ship carried hope and despair, leisure and endurance, luxury and loss. The emotional toll of travel was immense. Emigrants leaving Ireland during the famine, Germans leaving crowded villages, Scandinavians seeking land in America. All carried with them not just bundles of possessions, but the weight of separation. Families said goodbye on docks, often forever. Letters carried across oceans spoke of sorrow as much as hope. The voyage was exile and opportunity bound together, endured with the knowledge that home lay behind and uncertainty ahead. For the wealthy, by contrast, travel was framed as culture. The grand tour continued, aided by railways and steamships. Paris, Rome, Venice, Athens, destinations that once took weeks of planning were reached in days. Guidebooks told travelers what to see, how to behave, what was worth their attention. Sketches, journals, and photographs filled with images of ruins, galleries, and landscapes. These journeys were not only about education. They were about status, about being seen as worldly, refined, and part of a tradition of privilege. Tourism grew beyond the elite. Middle-class families, rising with industry and commerce, began to travel as well. With Baedeker's guides and Thomas Cook's tours, they navigated foreign cities, mountains, and seaside resorts. Excursions to Switzerland, Italy, or France became attainable if modest. At home, railways carried workers to Brighton, Blackpool, and Scarborough. Piers, promenades, and bathing machines appeared. Doctors recommended sea air as restorative. Workers saved wages for excursions, families walked beaches, children tasted salt water for the first time. Leisure, once the preserve of aristocrats, became part of ordinary life. Travel reshaped not only experience but imagination. Newspapers printed maps of rail lines, schedules of steamships, and reports of journeys abroad. Photographs and engravings showed pyramids, cathedrals, and mountains to those who would never leave Britain. Museums filled with artifacts brought from colonies. Stereoscopes created three-dimensional illusions of faraway places. Even those who stayed home consumed travel, imagining the world through the accounts of others. And yet, travel remained tiring. Even the wealthy complained of endless fatigue, of clothes soiled by soot, of meals interrupted by seasickness. Diaries filled with complaints about bad food, poor service, and exhausting itineraries. But beneath the frustration lay something profound, the fact that such journeys were possible at all. The Alps in a week, Paris in a day, New York in a fortnight. For the first time in history, ordinary people could move at speeds once unimaginable, and distances that once seemed vast began to shrink. Wherever you are tonight, picture yourself in that world. A clerk boarding a third-class carriage, clutching a ticket, soot already on your face. A gentleman sitting in a cushioned compartment, glancing out at blurred landscapes. A family huddled in steerage, seasick but determined. A lady in silk on the deck above, sipping tea in the wind. This was Victorian travel, unequal, exhausting, but transformative. A world carried forward on steam, its hardships endured, its marvels remembered. Every journey in the Victorian age carried hardship. Steam had made travel faster, but it had not made it easy. In fact, many travelers found that speed came at the cost of comfort. The stories we read in diaries, newspapers, and memoirs remind us that travel in the 19th century was often exhausting, unpleasant, and sometimes dangerous. Progress was real, but so too were the struggles of those who lived it. On the railway, soot and smoke were constant companions. Early carriages had poor ventilation, and sparks from the engine sometimes blew through open windows, burning clothes or singeing hair. The smell of coal clung to passengers, staining skin and fabric alike. Trains rattled over iron rails with a noise that made conversation difficult and left many with headaches after long journeys. Motion sickness was common, especially for those unused to speed. What we think of as convenience often felt to them like endurance. Delays and breakdowns were frequent. Engines overheated, wheels derailed, and signals failed. Passengers could be stranded on the line for hours, waiting for repairs, sometimes in cold rain or wind with little shelter. Accidents, too, were not rare. Newspapers reported with grim detail on collisions, derailments, and fires. One crash in 1861 at Clayton Tunnel in Sussex killed 23 people and injured hundreds, shocking the public and prompting calls for better safety. The fear of railway accidents lingered, even as millions continued to board trains. The hardships of sea travel were harsher still. Even wealthy passengers in cabins were not spared from seasickness. The constant roll of the ship, the smell of coal smoke and salt water, the creaking of timbers, all combined to unsettle the stomach. For those in steerage, the misery was compounded. Cramped quarters, poor ventilation, and limited sanitation made sickness inevitable. Buckets overflowed, the stench grew unbearable, and the cries of the seasick filled the dark holds. In storms, the suffering multiplied as waves threw passengers from bunks and seawater washed across decks. Disease was a constant threat. Cholera, typhus, dysentery, all could spread quickly in the cramped conditions of steerage. Outbreaks claimed lives, sometimes dozens on a single voyage. Quarantine stations waited at ports, where sick passengers might be detained or even turned away. Letters from emigrants described the horror of losing family members at sea, buried quickly in the waves, their hopes ended before they ever reached shore. On land, stagecoaches still operated in rural areas where railways had not yet reached. These journeys were slow, bumpy, and often uncomfortable. Passengers endured hours of jolting over rough roads, exposed to rain, snow, or blazing sun. Inns along the way varied in quality, offering food that was often coarse and lodging that was far from clean. Bandits were less common than in earlier centuries, but theft and fraud were still risks. The stagecoach was already a relic in the Victorian imagination, but for those who used it, the hardships were very real. Even for the wealthy, hardship was part of the experience. Luxury softened discomfort, but never removed it entirely. Diaries of upper-class travelers speak of endless fatigue, of the strain of long days in motion, of the disruption of routine. Clothes were soiled by soot, seasickness interrupted meals, and even the best accommodations were cramped compared to home. Travel was work, and only the wealthy had the leisure to frame it as adventure. For others, it was necessity endured in silence. The weather, too, played its part. Trains were delayed by snow or floods, ships by storms, coaches by mud and ice. Journeys could be thrown into chaos by forces beyond human control. Travelers carried with them not only luggage, but also patience, for every mile depended on conditions they could not predict. The unpredictability was itself a hardship, a reminder that progress had not conquered nature. There was also the emotional weight of travel. letters and memoirs remind us that leaving home was not easy. Emigrants endured not only physical hardship, but the sorrow of separation. Families said goodbye at docks and stations, sometimes forever. The uncertainty of arrival, the fear of illness, the strangeness of foreign lands, all added layers of anxiety. To travel was to endure not only physical discomfort, but also emotional strain. And yet, within these hardships, there was resilience. People adapted. They carried food to make up for bad provisions. They shared songs to drown out seasickness. They found humor in soot-stained faces and endless delays. Travel became part of life, its discomforts expected rather than exceptional. The hardships shaped memory, becoming stories told and retold, evidence of endurance and grit. So when we think of Victorian travel, we must set aside the romantic image of speed and novelty, and remember the fatigue, the noise, the sickness, and the danger. We must imagine the soot in the air, the roll of the sea, the endless jolting of the coach. We must picture the weary faces of passengers who endured it all, not for leisure, but because travel was becoming unavoidable in a world remade by steam and ambition. Wherever you are tonight, imagine yourself in a third-class railway carriage, the air thick with smoke, your clothes marked by soot, your body sore from hours on a hard bench. Or picture yourself in steerage, the ship rolling, the air heavy with sickness, the sound of waves crashing outside. These were the realities of Victorian travel, progress measured not in comfort, but in endurance. Not every journey in the Victorian age was about hardship or necessity. As steam carried people farther and faster, new possibilities opened. For the first time in history, large numbers of ordinary men and women could consider travel not only as duty, migration, or endurance, but as leisure. Tourism, in its modern form, was born in this age. It was uneven, still expensive for many, still uncomfortable even at its best, but it marked a shift. The idea of leaving home for the sake of rest, discovery, or even curiosity was Victorian in spirit, and it spread quickly. The Grand Tour, long a tradition of the aristocracy, continued. Young men of wealth still traveled through Europe, sketching ruins, visiting galleries, and cultivating a sense of culture. But the steam age changed its character. No longer did the tour take years by carriage and sail. Now it could be accomplished in months, aided by railways and steamships. The tradition lost some of its exclusivity as the rising middle class began to imitate it, albeit in shorter and simpler form. Guidebooks became indispensable. Carl Baedeker's red-bound volumes offered practical instructions, listing hotels, routes, and sites, giving travelers the confidence to venture abroad. For the first time, tourism was structured, predictable, and increasingly accessible. Thomas Cook revolutionized tourism even further. Beginning with organized group excursions in the 1840s, he arranged cheap tickets for railway journeys, taking groups to the countryside, to seaside resorts, or to exhibitions in London. What had once been out of reach for factory workers and clerks now became possible. A day trip to Brighton, a weekend in Scarborough, or even, for the more ambitious, a tour to Paris or Switzerland. Cook's tours were carefully managed, with everything planned to minimize uncertainty. They lacked the spontaneity of aristocratic travel, but they gave thousands their first taste of life beyond the factory or office. The seaside became the great stage of Victorian tourism. Towns like Brighton, Blackpool, and Scarborough expanded rapidly, their beaches filling with families escaping smoke-filled cities. Railways brought day-trippers in their thousands. Piers were built, promenades laid out, bathing machines rolled into the waves. Doctors recommended sea air as a cure for ailments of the lungs, skin, and nerves. Families saved wages for holidays, bringing children to splash in cold waves and adults to walk along promenades under parasols. Seaside resorts became symbols of leisure, reshaping entire towns into economies built around visitors. Inland tourism flourished as well. Spa towns like Bath, Buxton, and Harrogate drew visitors seeking health in mineral waters. The Victorian belief in the curative power of nature meant that mountains, lakes, and rural retreats also gained popularity. The Lake District inspired poetry and walking tours. Switzerland, with its dramatic Alps, became iconic for those who could afford the journey. Railways carried tourists to mountain bases, and mule rides or hiking expeditions took them further. The romantic ideal of nature, mixed with the practicality of steam, turned the mountains into destinations. Tourism also reached across borders. Paris attracted visitors with its boulevards, cafes, and exhibitions. Rome and Venice remained essential stops for those seeking culture and history. Egypt became a place of fascination, its monuments offering both exoticism and antiquity. Steamships on the Nile carried tourists past temples, while camel rides to the pyramids became almost cliché in memoirs of the time. Tourism abroad was still limited to those with means, but its reach was growing, fed by railways, ships, and the appetite for novelty. Tourism was not always glamorous. Hotels varied in quality, with some offering comfort, but others infested with vermin. Trains were often crowded, timetables delayed, and meals disappointing. Tourists complained in letters and diaries about noise, fatigue, and confusion. Yet behind the complaints lay excitement. The fact that they could complain about hotels in Rome or delays in Paris was itself remarkable. Travel was no longer a privilege of the few. It was becoming a shared experience, uneven but expanding. Tourism reshaped not only travelers but destinations. Towns grew to meet demand with new hotels, amusements, and services. Local traditions were adjusted, sometimes altered entirely, to cater to visitors. Tourism created new economies, reshaping landscapes into attractions. By the end of the century, whole industries revolved around holidays, from rail companies offering excursion tickets to entrepreneurs building seaside piers. The idea of holiday-making was embedded into society. It also reshaped identity. To travel was to aspire, to demonstrate that one had risen enough in life to afford leisure. Middle-class families spoke proudly of their trips, bringing home souvenirs and stories. Even working-class excursions carried meaning, offering proof of participation in a broader world. Tourism was not only rest. It was status, imagination, and culture. So when we think of Victorian travel, we must remember not only the emigrant in steerage or the clerk in a smoky third-class carriage, but also the family walking along a pier in Blackpool, the clerk with a Baedeker in Rome, the child tasting salt water for the first time. Tourism was a quieter revolution, but it transformed lives as much as railways or steamships. Wherever you are tonight, picture yourself arriving by train in a seaside town. The air is sharp with salt, the station filled with families carrying baskets and parasols. Children run ahead, adults pause to look at the sea. Or imagine stepping off a steamer in Switzerland, mountains rising above, your guidebook in hand. The journey is tiring, the accommodations plain, but the wonder is real. This was Victorian tourism, aspiration and endurance, leisure and fatigue, woven together in the age of steam. For the Victorians, travel was not confined to the boundaries of Britain or Europe. The age of steam coincided with the height of the British Empire, and with empire came both the means and the motivation to travel farther. India, Egypt, Africa, and the Far East became not only colonies or places of trade, but destinations of curiosity, fascination, and spectacle. For many travelers, to move abroad was to step into lands they imagined as exotic, unfamiliar, and yet, through empire, somehow theirs to consume. India held a central place in this imagination. Long under the rule of the East India Company, and after 1858, under direct crown authority, India became both an administrative hub and a destination. Soldiers, administrators, missionaries, and merchants traveled there in growing numbers. Steamships and later, the Suez Canal shortened the journey dramatically. What had once taken months of sailing around Africa's Cape now took weeks. The journey remained exhausting. Seasickness, cramped cabins, and oppressive heat were constant companions, but it was possible on a scale never before imagined. Travelers wrote of India with fascination. They described its heat, its crowded bazaars, its temples and palaces. Letters home mixed admiration with condescension, marveling at the grandeur of architecture while treating local people as curiosities. Tourism, in the modern sense, also began to develop. Wealthy Britons visited India not to govern or trade, but to look, to experience what they imagined as the exotic. They traveled by rail across the subcontinent, visited the Taj Mahal, and returned with stories, souvenirs, and photographs. Their experiences were framed by empire, their curiosity shaped by the power they assumed over the land they traversed. Egypt became another key site of fascination. The pyramids, the Sphinx, and the Nile offered both antiquity and exoticism. After the Suez Canal opened in 1869, Egypt was not only a spectacle but a vital artery of empire. Tourists rode camels to the pyramids, floated on steamers up the Nile, and bought souvenirs in Cairo's markets. Guidebooks described these sites in detail, encouraging visitors to see them as musts on a traveler's itinerary. The Victorians treated Egypt as both a timeless monument to the past and a contemporary part of British influence. Africa, 2. Entered Victorian consciousness through travel and exploration. Figures like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley became celebrities for their journeys into the interior. Their accounts of rivers, jungles, and encounters with African peoples filled newspapers and captivated readers. For most Victorians, Africa was unreachable, imagined through the words and illustrations of explorers. But for a small number, missionaries, colonial officials, or tourists, it became a destination, framed through the language of endurance, discovery, and empire. The hardships of heat, insects, and disease were written as tests of character, proof of British resolve and civilizing mission. Not all imperial travel was about leisure. Many journeys were assignments, soldiers sent to garrisons, missionaries dispatched to convert, administrators relocated to posts. For them, travel was duty, not choice. But even here, the language of exoticism shaped their letters home, their memoirs, their self-understanding. To travel within empire was to move not only through geography, but through identity, to be both British and abroad, to define oneself against what was imagined as foreign. The cultural appetite for exotic travel extended far beyond those who actually went. Exhibitions in Britain brought the empire home. The Great Exhibition of 1851 in London displayed goods, artifacts, and images from across the globe, letting thousands who never left the city imagine travel through objects and design. Museums filled with artifacts shipped back from colonies. Photographs circulated. Stereoscopes offered three-dimensional illusions of temples and ruins, and travel literature thrived. Even those who never left their hometowns consumed empire through imagination. Travel was not only lived, it was shared, published, and displayed. The souvenirs themselves tell the story. Scarabs from Egypt, fabrics from India, carvings from Africa, all became part of Victorian drawing rooms. To own such objects was to display connection, not only to foreign lands, but to empire itself. The exotic became part of domestic life, woven into culture, conversation, and identity. Travel extended its reach into every home, even those of people who never boarded a ship. But empire also sharpened inequalities. Colonized peoples rarely traveled as freely as Britons, and when they did, they were often exoticized themselves. The structures of empire shaped who moved, how they moved, and what that movement meant. A British tourist in Egypt was a participant in imperial spectacle. An Egyptian in London might be displayed in exhibitions as an example of otherness. Travel was not neutral. It was structured by power, and the Victorian world reflected that at every turn. The fascination with the exotic was complicated. It carried admiration at the scale of monuments, at the richness of landscapes, but it also carried arrogance, framing other cultures as curiosities or as raw material for European imagination. Tourists admired pyramids while dismissing local life, collected artifacts while ignoring their meaning, wrote diaries filled with detail and dismissal side by side. To read their accounts is to hear both curiosity and condescension in the same breath. Yet beneath it, there was a universal impulse, the desire to see, to step beyond the familiar, to witness the world. The Victorians, like travelers today, were driven by curiosity. They wanted to encounter landscapes, monuments, and people they had never seen. Empire shaped their lens, but curiosity shaped their journeys. Wherever you are tonight, picture yourself stepping off a steamer in Egypt. The air is heavy with heat, the pyramids rising in the distance. Imagine riding a camel, awkward and unsteady, while a guide leads you across the sand. Imagine floating on a Nile steamer, temples appearing on the banks as the water carries you forward. Or picture arriving in India, the station crowded with travelers, the air filled with noise and color. This was Victorian exotic travel, fueled by empire, shaped by power, but remembered in curiosity, discomfort, and wonder alike. Victorian travel was not only about the act of moving across landscapes or seas. It was also about what came back, the words, the images, the objects, and the ideas that circulated long after journeys ended. Travel reshaped culture, embedding itself into literature, art, museums, and even the rhythm of conversation at dinner tables. In this way, it touched far more lives than those who ever stepped onto a platform or a deck. Literature became the great vessel of travel memory. Newspapers published accounts of journeys, serialized in columns for readers who might never leave their towns. Books multiplied, memoirs of the Grand Tour, diaries of emigrants, reports from explorers. Charles Dickens wrote about his journeys in America, mixing sharp criticism with fascination at a society in motion. Anthony Trollope described the trials of European travel, his irritation at inns, trains, and endless fatigue. Missionaries filled pages with descriptions of Africa, India, and the Pacific, framing them as both strange and in need of salvation. These accounts entertained, informed, and reassured readers at home that Britain was at the center of a world worth knowing. Travel writing was never neutral. It carried the biases of its authors, the lens of class, culture, and empire. But it was powerful. For those who never traveled, it was the only window into the wider world. A factory worker in Manchester might never see the Alps, but he could read about them in a serialized account. A family in Yorkshire might never set foot in India, but they could imagine bazaars through missionary letters. Travel writing expanded the mental map of Victorians, shrinking the world into words they could hold in hand. Illustrations amplified this effect. Engravings filled magazines with images of trains cutting through valleys, steamships departing harbors, pyramids towering over deserts. Later in the century, photography entered the scene. Though still slow and cumbersome, it brought unprecedented realism. Photographs of ruins, landscapes, and people circulated, turning imagination into something more concrete. Families purchased stereoscopes, sliding cards into viewers to see pyramids, mountains, and cathedrals appear in 3 dimensions. Even those who never traveled could consume the world through vision. Souvenirs carried travel into homes in tangible form. Scarabs from Egypt, fabrics from India, seashells from the Mediterranean. These became part of Victorian drawing rooms. They were not only tokens of memory for travelers, but displays of connection and status. To own an object from abroad was to demonstrate participation in a wider world, even if only indirectly. For the wealthy, souvenirs were evidence of culture. For the middle classes, they were proof of aspiration. For emigrants, sometimes the only souvenirs were letters, trinkets, or photographs carried across oceans, binding memory to place. Maps held deep cultural significance. With railways, maps of routes became everyday tools. Newspapers published them, showing readers the reach of iron lines. Atlases displayed the empire, coloring vast territories in British red, shaping identity through geography. Maps were not only guides but symbols, compressing distances into diagrams that could be owned, studied, and admired. For Victorians, to possess a map was to grasp the world in miniature, to believe that space could be understood and ordered. Museums institutionalized travel memory. The British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and countless smaller collections filled with artifacts brought back from colonies and travels. Natural history collections grew with specimens gathered abroad. These objects turned travel into public culture. Visitors who never left London could stand before Egyptian statues, Indian fabrics, or African carvings, imagining themselves connected to empire. Museums became spaces of symbolic travel, letting people consume the world within glass cases. The arts reflected travel vividly. Turner painted railways as blurs of light and color, capturing the strangeness of speed. Other artists painted more literal scenes, stations bustling with passengers, ships braving storms, tourists gazing at ruins. These images filled galleries, magazines, and homes, making travel part of the shared visual culture. The very image of progress was painted in steam, rails, and smoke. Education was shaped by travel as well. Children learned geography not only through books but through maps, atlases, and sometimes artifacts brought back by relatives or displayed in schools. Missionary societies distributed pamphlets filled with accounts of faraway lands, shaping young imaginations around empire and exploration. Travel was not just personal experience. It was pedagogy, forming part of what Victorians understood about themselves and others. Even leisure at home reflected travel culture. Families gathered in parlors to read travel accounts aloud, to look at stereoscope cards, or to discuss letters from emigrant relatives abroad. Travel became a shared topic of curiosity, even for those who would never leave their county. The language of motion, distance, and the exotic entered everyday conversation, reminding everyone that the world was changing. The cultural impact of travel was not only outward. It also reshaped the way Victorians thought of home. To see Paris was to compare it to London. To walk in Rome was to measure it against British history. To visit India was to reaffirm Britain's sense of itself in contrast. Travel became a mirror. To look outward was also to reflect inward. Britain defined itself partly through what it saw abroad, and culture at home absorbed that reflection. So when we think of Victorian travel, we must not picture only the train or the ship, but also the book on the shelf, the map on the wall, the souvenir on the mantel, the stereoscope on the table. These were the ways travel lingered, shaping culture long after the journey ended. Travel was not only lived, it was remembered, consumed, and retold until it became part of identity itself. Wherever you are tonight, imagine yourself in a Victorian parlor. A family sits together. On the table lies a guidebook, a map spread open, a small figurine from Egypt placed beside a stereoscope. They take turns looking through the viewer, exclaiming at the illusion of three-dimensional pyramids. They read aloud from a travel memoir, imagining distant lands. None of them may ever travel far, but in that moment they are connected to the wider world through words, images, and imagination. This was the cultural impact of Victorian travel, an expansion of mind and memory, carried not only by those who went but by everyone who shared in the stories they brought home. The story of Victorian travel is not only about trains and ships. It is about how those journeys changed lives, reshaped societies, and left marks that remain with us still. When we look back, we see a century defined by movement, the rattle of carriages, the roll of ships, the steady rhythm of locomotives. To the Victorians, travel was no longer something distant, extraordinary, or reserved for the very few. It was becoming part of life. Hardship, aspiration, endurance, and curiosity carried forward by steam. Before this era, journeys were measured in weeks and months. By its end, days and hours defined distance. Railways connected cities and towns, collapsing space into timetables. Steamships crossed oceans in weeks instead of months, carrying emigrants in steerage and gentlemen in luxury cabins. The Suez Canal shortened voyages to India, pulling colonies closer to the imperial center. Distance itself seemed to shrink, and with it, the imagination of what was possible expanded. The legacy is visible in tourism. The seaside holiday, the foreign tour, the idea of setting aside time for leisure. These were Victorian inventions. Resorts like Brighton and Blackpool grew from fishing towns into destinations, piers and promenades built to entertain. Switzerland's Alps became icons of scenery, Egypt's pyramids part of the tourist imagination, Rome and Venice staples of culture. The modern holiday was born in the grit and novelty of Victorian travel. The legacy is visible in culture. Travel books became ancestors of today's guides and blogs. Photographs and stereoscopes anticipated our endless images. Souvenirs and postcards began traditions we still follow. The Victorians consumed travel in the same way we do, through stories, pictures, and tokens, weaving journeys into memory and imagination. The legacy is visible in inequality. Just as first class and steerage divided travelers, so too does privilege shape travel today. Airports, cruise ships, and trains still separate comfort from necessity. Migration remains filled with hardship, while leisure travel caters to wealth. The Victorian divide between velvet and soot, chandeliers and steerage bunks, lingers in new forms. The legacy is visible in empire. Victorian travel was entwined with colonial power. The fascination with the exotic, the collecting of artifacts, the framing of other cultures as spectacle, all were bound to empire. Today, we still wrestle with these legacies in tourism and museums, in how we view the world and how the world views us. Travel is never only movement. It is shaped by history, power, and imagination, just as it was in the 19th century. And the legacy is visible in imagination itself. Victorians marveled at speed, at the shrinking of the world, but also feared it. They worried that movement was unnatural, that life was accelerating beyond human pace. Those anxieties sound familiar today. We marvel at airplanes and instant connections, but we also worry about what is lost when distance collapses. The Victorian age reminds us that every advance in travel carries both wonder and unease, both freedom and fatigue. So when we ask what Victorian travel was really like, the answer is layered. It was soot on the face and velvet on the seat. It was seasickness in steerage and chandeliers in saloons. It was the fatigue of endless jolts and the marvel of arriving in Paris in a single day. It was exile across oceans and leisure by the sea. It was a world in motion, filled with discomfort and discovery, hardship and hope. Wherever you are tonight, imagine yourself in a Victorian station at dusk. A locomotive hisses in the lamplight. First-class passengers step into cushioned compartments while workers climb into smoky wagons. Across the sea, a steamship pulls out of harbor, emigrants huddled below, couples strolling above. Together they form a world reshaped by steam, uncertain but determined. That world is gone, but its memory lingers in every timetable, every holiday, every story of travel we still tell. This was Victorian travel. Not glamorous, not simple, but real, filled with hardship, filled with wonder, and carried forward by the quiet endurance of millions. And it is in that endurance, more than any luxury or invention, that its true legacy remains. Thank you for traveling with Mild History tonight. If you are watching, let us know where you are tuning in from. Your presence at this table of quiet stories matters. Like and subscribe if you would like more journeys like this. Not rushed, not dramatic, but slow, detailed, and perhaps a little boring in the best way. Because sometimes history is not fireworks. Sometimes history is a long journey by steam, remembered in silence.